The date is Sunday, April the 14th, 1912. While the world sleeps peacefully, out on the North Atlantic, the course of history is about to be altered forever. Titanic, the largest ship in the world. A floating palace, she is on her maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York, with 2,208 passengers and crew aboard her. And she is about to have a rendezvous with destiny. A destiny in the form of a massive mountain of ice. I'm Matthew Smathers. Welcome to Titanic Wreck Tours. Welcome to Episode 1 of Titanic Wreck Tours. I shall be your host as we take a look around the wreck of Titanic and explore the secrets that this sunken giant has to offer. As we explore the wreck of Titanic, you will be hearing the testimonies of her survivors, as well as the histories of some of those who perished.
There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came out from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there.
The sea was perfectly smooth when we left the ship. Every star in the heavens was visible, but there was no moon. Well, we got away clear of the ship, and we just laid on the oars until eventually they realized that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything.
They say there are places on this earth where the voices of history can still be heard and felt. Today, modern vessels such as cargo ships and cruise liners crisscross these waters, uncaringly of the history that came before them. However, this is no ordinary spot. For beneath these waters is the most famous ship in history. The Royal Mail ship Titanic. In April of 1912, the Royal Mail ship Titanic is the largest moving object ever made by man. She is not only large, but she is also luxurious. Certainly one of the most beautiful vessels ever created, she is on her maiden voyage across the North Atlantic. A voyage that she and nearly 1,500 of her passengers and crew will never finish. Today, the Titanic sleeps peacefully at the bottom of the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles below its surface. At such a depth, very few people are able to actually reach the site and explore her remains. But of those precious few explorers who are willing to dare the challenges of the deep, the voices of history are never far from this site. These echoes from the deep resonate with every explorer to the Titanic. And now, it's our turn to explore the Titanic and to hear those stories told from those who were actually there. Our tour of the Titanic begins at the bow, and as we cross over the now iconic forward railing, we make a close pass over the ship's anchor crane. This crane serviced the large spare anchor directly below, and was also used for mooring operations when Titanic was tied up to the pier. Located directly beside, on the left or right of the crane, are the large fair leads, or rollers, which were intended to secure Titanic's mooring lines when she was tied up to the dock. Titanic's massive anchor chains. Each length of chain is still firmly attached to an anchor, and each single link in the chain weighs 175 pounds. Now we are passing over the twin windlasses, which were each powered by a steam motor below that would raise the anchor. The brake wheels for the anchor chains can be seen directly below, and right behind them, the number 1 cargo hatch. Like many ships of the day, the Titanic carried a general variety of cargo, which included commercial-grade shipments of rubber, textiles, typewriters, even a brand-new 1912 Coupe de Ville that was crated up and belonged to Mr. William Carter. Experts tend to tell us that the car was red, and it's likely buried in the wreckage, even to this day. Traveling aft, we come across the forward well deck. Here we can see the ship's mast, which has now fallen across the open well deck, as well as the remnants of the crow's nest. Directly below the mast are the twin cargo hatches, which would have serviced the first-class baggage compartment, the mail room, and the luggage holds. The area we are passing over is identical to that seen in this original 1912 film, shot aboard Titanic's older sister, the Olympic. As we continue our tour, we travel aft over the cargo cranes to take a look at the first-class forward-facing promenade on A deck and B deck. That fallen bulkhead is on the A deck level and is the same bulkhead that can be seen in this original photograph taken by Father Francis Brown just before Titanic arrived in Queenstown. The windows are the same as in the photo, as is the bulkhead. Directly above, the nerve center of the ship, Titanic's bridge. It was from here that all operations were conducted for the handling of the ship. However, much of the bridge was destroyed in the sinking and the subsequent years on the bottom. However, though the bridge was destroyed, the telemotor, which once mounted Titanic's wheel, still remains. It was at this very spot, on April 14th, 1912, that Quartermaster Hitchens vainly attempted to avoid the collision with the iceberg. Moving along to the starboard side of the ship, we see the collapsed remnants of the Promenade Deck on A deck. The windows you see with the doorway are on the B deck level, and actually would have opened into one of the 2 millionaire suites. It was upon this deck, the boat deck, where Titanic's lifeboats once sat. Lifeboats which carried space for just 1,200 people. Traveling across the now destroyed boat deck, we come upon a collapsing wall. This bulkhead is the entrance to the grand staircase. To a wreck explorer, the grand staircase represents the ultimate opportunity to explore inside the Titanic. To a passenger in 1912, the grand staircase, which stretched from the boat deck all the way down to F deck, represented the single best and most opulent place on the ship to be seen. It was truly a ship of dreams, in every way.
She was the last word in luxury. All her public rooms were absolutely amazing. All the woodwork was beautifully carved, and she had everything that you could think of. She was a beautiful ship.
They have many card parties and get people acquainted. We had deck courts, and they did all they could to make her happy.
As our cameras drop down into the interior of the grand staircase, we can see this bulkhead upon which the great carved clock once stood.
They were enjoying life. They should do. They had everything. Finest food they ever could be prepared for them, and all the luxury of having wonderful public rooms to go to, orchestra, dances. Lifeboats were a thing that they weren't necessary. You see, we were on a ship that was unsinkable.
Traveling further down the ruined corridors of the Titanic, we come across an original chandelier still hanging from the ruins of the ceiling. The woodwork is remarkably intact. Our cameras travel down the corridors to peer into the first-class passenger cabins. Most of the walls have long since crumbled, and strange stalactite forms of life, known as rusticles, dangle from every surface. The rusticles are actually a form of bacteria that is eating Titanic.
We had a very wonderful cabin. It had 2 bunks and a couch in it, and the couch was turned into a bed at night, and I had the couch for my bed.
As our camera explores the interior of Titanic, we come across a brass bed in cabin A25. Cabin A25 was, of course, unoccupied. The Titanic was built to carry 3,300 passengers and crew, though on her ill-fated first and last voyage, she would carry about 2,200. The large marble sink is still intact, though buried in debris, as well as the brass and bronze accented bed frames, the headboard looking remarkably good considering its age. As our camera tilts around to take a look around the room, we catch a glimpse of the ceiling, much of which has largely collapsed. The interiors of Titanic are very disorientating to explore, and we will have to have a more in-depth exploration later. For all her luxury, the Titanic was not without purpose. She was purposely built as an immigrant ship to ply the North Atlantic passenger trade to take immigrants from Europe to the New World. The Titanic's maiden voyage saw her depart Southampton, England for New York by way of Cherbourg and Queenstown. a voyage which was expected to last just 7 days. And with minor exception to the events of her departure, most of Titanic's survivors would recall the events leading up to the 14th as unmemorable and uneventful.
We were steaming that night at a good 22 knots. At 10 o'clock, I was relieved as officer of the watch by Murdoch, W.M. Murdoch. He and I had been shipmates in many of the ocean greyhounds. After the usual formalities, I handed over, wished him joy of a few perishing cold hours, went below. I expect his watch went on as mine had done. Nothing to see and nothing to hear, except the distant roar of the water at her bows, that and the half-hourly bells with a lookout must cry of all's well. Of course, he knew nothing of the death trap lying ahead of us, any more than I did.
As we travel up the now fallen mast, the stage is set for disaster. That twisted piece of steel you see laying across the mast is all that remains of the crow's nest where lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were peering into the night. That wire you see coming through the door frame was once attached to the telephone, and above the door frame is a bracket which once held Titanic's bell.
But barely 10 minutes had passed after the sound of the last bell when there were 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell, followed by a cry from the lookout cage, "Ice right ahead, sir." Murdoch evidently saw the mass of ice practically at the same time as the lookout men, and shouted, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern." His idea was to swing her bow clear, and then put the helm hard over the other way, and so swing her stern clear. And given half a chance, I believe he'd have done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck. She took the blow on her starboard side, masses of ice actually falling on the foredeck.
And as I got out on the promenade deck, I saw a large grey, well, it looked to me like a building floating by. Great big grey thing. But that building kept bumping along the rail, and as it bumped, it sliced off bits of ice, and ice fell all over the deck.
I looked along the side and I saw what I thought was a windjammer, but as it came astern I saw it was an iceberg.
I was talking to a pal of mine. He was sitting on my bunk. All of a sudden, she came to a halt. There was no fuss. It was like putting your brakes on a car, and you gradually came to a halt. And I went for it on the promenade deck, and I looked down. I couldn't see any damage at all above the waterline. But what I did see was ice in the well deck, the forward well deck. And I thought, hello, we've hit an iceberg.
And I, and a great many of my foolish fellow passengers, we just picked up the ice and started to play snowballs. We thought it was fun. We asked the officers if there was any danger and said, no, nothing at all, nothing at all. Nothing at all, just a mere nothing. We just hit an iceberg. It's nothing, nothing.
And I got to the bridge, and the captain had evidently arrived about the same moment. And I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter? What have you stuck? He said, we've stuck an iceberg, sir.
Desiring to assess the damage correctly, Captain Smith orders Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer, to assess the damage. Andrews' report is grim. The iceberg has popped rivets, opened seams, and torn openings in the first 6 compartments in Titanic's hull. The watertight doors, which had been shut immediately after the collision, will hold the water back, but only temporarily. Andrews predicts she has about an hour, 2 at the most, before she completely sinks. As our cameras pass over the Titanic's officers' quarters, we come upon the Marconi room skylight.
And I got back to the boat deck and saw the captain, and I told him, I said, the mailroom's filling, sir. Should I send a distress signal? And the captain said, I've already sent a distress signal, and Phillips, the wireless operator, is bending over his instrument, the telephone, holding the telephone. He says, I'm in contact with the Carpathia.
Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, desperately try to call for help. The Carpathia, a Cunard liner, is eastbound from New York to the Mediterranean. However, though the closest ship to respond, she will not arrive for 4 hours.
By then, the captain had ordered out lifeboats and women and children. Lower the lifeboats and stand by. That was the order. Stand by.
As Titanic's lifeboats are uncovered and swung out, Captain Smith decides to not create a panic. As a consequence, most of Titanic's officers are not aware that the ship is actually sinking. And consequently, many passengers question the sanity of leaving the ship in the middle of the night.
At the time of getting away the first U-boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others, for there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat.
Now, we were told we were only going to leave because it was rules and regulations. No danger whatsoever. We'd all be back for breakfast. And I thought it was perfectly asinine to leave a warm, comfortable ship to come back for breakfast. Oh, that was why. The English have got rules and regulations, but they're just plumb crazy. I'm sticking to this ship.
The drop from the boat deck to the water was about between 70 and 80 feet. And you could hardly see the water, and people didn't want to go. They got in their minds she was unsinkable.
But the Titanic is not unsinkable. As the great liner slowly settles at the bow, the passengers begin to evacuate the ship. However, many elect to remain behind. Though debatable as to how many of the crew understood the seriousness of the situation, few of the passengers actually can comprehend that Titanic is in any danger. On the starboard side boat deck, Lifeboat number 7 is one of the first, if not the first, to be launched. With a capacity for 65, she leaves the ship with only 28 people, including actress Dorothy Gibson and lookout Archie Jewell. Gibson would star in Saved from the Titanic, the first ever motion picture to be done about the disaster, while Archie Jewell would survive the sinking of the Britannic, Titanic's sister, in the First World War. Moving in for a closer look on the Titanic's Promenade Deck, on A deck, we get a good look at the windows that once graced this elegant part of the ship with natural sunlight and illuminated the interior cabins. The call for women and children to board the lifeboats seems to have been different in the various parts of the ship. Whereas the first class were roused from their sleep by their personal stewards and maids, the second class received a knock on the door, while most third class were either not informed or were simply told to go to the general rooms and gathering areas and await instructions. Second-class passenger Ava Hart vividly recalls how her father left them to discover the nature of the situation, and then returned to take them up to the boat deck.
My father came back very quickly because he could get up to the boat deck in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. And he came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly around me as if I were a baby. And without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. My father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said, they are going to launch lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast.
The prevailing thought seemed to be that during the evacuation of Titanic, most of the passengers would simply evacuate as a precaution while the crew tended to whatever the matter was. To keep spirits up, at the entrance to the grand staircase, Wallace Hartley and the Titanic's orchestra began to play ragtime tunes to calm the nerves of the passengers. Nearby, a twisted lifeboat davit once held lifeboat number 8. Here, as the crew gestured for passengers to board, onto the deck stepped Mr. Isidore Strauss and his wife, Ida. Mr. Strauss, one of the co-founders of Macy's department store, was denied a seat in the boat, and his wife stepped out of the boat, having gotten in, and decided to remain by her husband, telling him, "We have been together for many years. Where you go, I go." Moving along the portside boat deck, we soon come to the remnants of lifeboat station number 6. The davits are gone, leaving only the chocks that once cradled the lifeboats and the turnbuckles that once secured them. Here, as passengers were being, in some cases, forcibly placed, Denver mining millionairess Margaret Maggie Brown stood watching and assisting some of her fellow passengers before an officer rudely picked her up and placed her in the boat. Unruffled by the experience, she would later all but commandeer the lifeboat, encourage the women to row to keep warm, reprimand Quartermaster Hitchens at the tiller, and would live on in Titanic history as the unsinkable Molly Brown.
As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. Just when I first realized how desperately serious things were, I don't know. But I do know that before many boats were away, I got to piling more and more people into them. Partly because I now knew she was going, and partly because the boats were not remaining by the ship to be filled to their full capacity when waterborne.
The reason that the lifeboats would not return to pick up more survivors until after Titanic had already gone down was an understandable fear of suction. For most of Titanic's survivors believed that the great liner would create a vortex in the ocean as it went down and to pull them down with it. Consequently, many of them chose to stay away from the ship.
The captain came across the bridge and said, "Mr. Boxall, you go away in that boat," pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. And he said, "Hurry up, Mr. Whale's waiting to lower it." So I tumbled into this lifeboat and we got lowered down. I found that I only had 3 of the ship's crew, a steward, a cook, and a sailor. She had been lowered very slowly. She wouldn't run until you helped the falls. and eventually became waterborne. I tried to count the passengers, but it was difficult as they didn't speak English, you see. And I reckon that I had between 30, around about 30 on board the boat. I had great difficulty in getting the boat round there. There was suction. I was using a stroke oar standing up, and there was a lady helping. She was steering the boat round the ship's stern. When I passed round the boat, to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them.
This is the starboard or outer wing propeller. The Titanic, of course, had 3, and the outer propellers were the largest. Each massive propeller had a diameter of 23.5 feet, or 7.2 meters. As the great ship went down at the bow, her massive stern rose into the night sky, lifting the propellers high into the air. One cannot help but wonder if this propeller was last glimpsed by Boxall as he rode beneath the stern.
Amazing. Very good.
As the forward angle of Titanic's list increased, it became clear to many on board that something was definitely wrong. Still thinking it nothing too serious, Colonel John Jacob Astor took his pregnant bride, Madeline, to Lifeboat number 4 on the A-deck promenade. Astor loaded his wife through these windows and then asked Second Officer Lightoller if he could accompany her since she was in a delicate condition. Officer Lightoller refused, stating it was women and children only. The colonel politely bowed aside, kissed his wife farewell, and then asked Officer Lightoller what lifeboat she was being loaded in so he could locate her later. He then stepped aside and watched the lifeboat being lowered. It would be the last time Madeline Astor ever saw him. It was around this time, about 1:40, that lifeboat number 14 was being launched. In it was Ava Hart and her mother. Her father, having put them into the boat, helped to lower it and watched them lower away out of sight.
And so they launched these boats, and my father helped. He knew a lot about the sea. And he put me in the lifeboat and told me to be good. He said to me, hold Mummy's hand, and I thought he was coming after me, but he didn't. Then it dawned on me, of course, that he wasn't coming, that I wouldn't see him anymore.
It was so sad to have to take the wives away from their husbands and leave the husbands up on deck. And I knew that she was sinking then. And I knew what chances we were just waiting for death.
Everywhere on Titanic, families were being torn apart forever. And yet, on the starboard forward boat station, lifeboat number 1, being launched by First Officer William Murdoch, a mystery was being born. Lifeboat number 1 left the Titanic with only 12 seats occupied. How was this possible at such a late stage in the sinking that a lifeboat was allowed to be launched virtually empty? The answers will never be known. What is known, however, is that the boat's prolific passengers, Sir Cosmo and Lucille Lady Duff Gordon, would become the focal point of controversy for decades to come. The mystery over boat number 1, its occupants, the reason for its launch, and the reasoning behind its not returning to pick up survivors will become a hot-button topic that is debated even to this day.
Well, I made up my mind I wasn't going to leave the ship. Bruce Ismay stood on B deck and kept calling out, all women and children, come to B deck. I went up twice. It was so cold. I thought myself idiotic. I'm going back. And I went back twice to A deck and sat down until finally Bruce Ismay spied me. He called out to me, he said, "All women and children." I thought it left the ship. "Come up here." And I looked down and found I'd lost one of my buckles on my shoe. I wanted that buckle. I was that much interested in the buckle and absolutely disinterested in anything pertaining to saving my life, because after all, it was an unsinkable ship, you see. What could happen to me? Moreover, I had my little pig. Nothing could happen to me. So I walked along the rail, and I found a gentleman standing at the rail. Strangely enough, the very gentleman that I had told on the tender that I was frightened to take the Titanic. And he said to me, "Hello, come on, you're going to get off of this ship." I said, "Not me. How do you expect me to get off of anything with this thing I've got on? I'm a prisoner in my own skirt. I can't even walk, much less get up to that rail and then jump across the ocean into a lifeboat. Oh, no, not me. I'm not an acrobat." But he says, "You'll have to." And as I stood there arguing with him, and I had my little pig, mind you, under my arm, it was white, under my arm, a sailor came along. He said, "Yeah, now you can do as you want, but I'm going to save your baby." And he grabbed the pig, threw it into the lifeboat. So I turned around to Mr. Monk and I said, "That settles it. Here I go. I don't know how I'm going to go, but I've got to go. I'm going to follow that pig. I promised my mother." Well, he may have thought I was insane. Nobody knew what the pig meant to me. So he made a cradle of his hands with another gentleman. I sat on his hands, put my arms around his neck, and he threw me head foremost through space. And I fell in the bottom of the boat and kept looking and looking for my pig. I found him with his broken, poor little legs broken, and his nose gone. Well, made me feel very badly, but I kind of turned him. I found he was still playing music, so that was all right.
While Edith Russell was making her way to the water, the Titanic was settling lower and lower. It was at this point, as Titanic's decks were awash and the vessel was rapidly going down, that a throng of third-class passengers managed to make their way to the deck, only to discover the lifeboats were gone, and chaos ensued.
It was just one mad rush to get into the lifeboat.
There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was. There wasn't any panic at the time I got on the lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboat. But after that, then the others started coming up from their cabins. There were no boats. Gosh, there was panic. We could hear it.
And they were trying to jump into them as they went down. And all the boats had gone then.
Then came the very last boat of all. And it was a sort of raft with collapsible canvas sides, stowed up on top of the officers' quarters. And that's above the boat deck. A seaman named Hemming, he'd been with me in many of the mail boats. He and I cut this one adrift and threw it down on the water, which was now about 2 feet above the boat deck. Having dumped this collapsible, there was not a thing further we could do on that side, so both of us went over to the starboard side. But we found all the boats were away from there too. Of course, there were still hundreds of people round.
Meanwhile, at the grand staircase, Wallace Hartley and the Titanic's orchestra turned to a more somber tune. With water rushing up the deck, survivors would recall the song as Song d'Automne. However, most attribute the final song played as Nearer My God to Thee, a song that they played until the water washed them off the deck.
We rode out. I don't know how far it was, but it was beautiful, just a beautiful sight. It was, all the lights were on in the Titanic, and it was listing just a little bit in the front, you know, going down. But it was a beautiful sight.
For a long time we didn't move the boat. When we laid off on the starboard side, you could see by the arrangements of the lights, all the lights were burning, and you could see that she was going down. You could see that her stern was getting pretty low in the water. She was certainly going down, there was no doubt about it then.
Decks were lined with people, not getting off. They were lined with people looking over the railing.
As Hemming and I looked down from the top of the officer's quarter where we were standing, the ship took a sudden dip, and the sea came rolling up, carrying everyone with it. Many were drowned there and then. Everyone that could just instinctively started to scramble up towards the after end of the ship. But that was only putting it off. In fact, it was lessening their chances. The plunge had to come, and that I could see was pretty soon. And no one's chances were going to be improved by getting mixed up in the struggling mass. For my part, I turned forward and took a header from the top of the wheel. I started to swim away, but got sucked down 2 or 3 times. In fact, I got mighty near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside the collapse. We'd hove into the water from the top of the officer's quarter, and there I hung on. A bit later, the forward funnel guys carried away, and the funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft I had some of us hanging onto it by inches. There were a good many it didn't. Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards away from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink.
So much debris floating, and bodies, dead and alive, were all around there. So there were hundreds of them around the stern of that ship. They'd all seemed to drift down that way. They had 2 boards on the stern of the Titanic, which said heat clear propeller blades. And I was on the port one, hanging on. And eventually I slid off.
As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water.
So when the water rushed into the boilers, there was a terrible explosion. And that's when I thought the boat broke in half.
I had a life jacket on, and I hit the water with a crash. But I didn't hit anything in the water. I was lucky, very lucky.
And I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink. And I saw that ship break in half. and the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed like, heeled over. And we heard the dreadful sound of people drowning.
When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly, she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear.
I sat on the gunwale. The children were crying and whimpering. It suddenly struck me, I believe I'll play music, and then the little children maybe will be diverted and amused. And there I sat, and all night long I played them at cheech. And the poor little children were so interested in the music box that most of them stopped crying.
As she vanished, everyone round me on the upturned boat, as though they could hardly believe it, just said, "She's gone."
Well, we got away clear of the ship, and we just laid on the oars until eventually they realized that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything. And the screams went on for some considerable time.
Cold, freezing. That's what killed everybody. They didn't last long. You see, a lot of them went over with half their clothes on. They didn't last long. Anyway, when I found Rick's, and he'd hurt himself. He'd hurt his legs. He dropped on something. And he didn't say very much. He was a great big fellow, too. Very good swimmer. And he died, and I was eventually, I seemed to be all by myself. The cries, help, and prayers had all subsided, and everything was quiet.
The screams, absolutely ghastly. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone,